Her son and daughter dragged her into court, accusing her of stealing the family trust. Ruth Alton, retired CPA and grandmother, didn't argue. She brought records, ledgers, the notarized codicil they'd never bothered to read. By the time she sat down, the judge was already flipping pages and recognized her own signature. Her children came with claims. She came with proof. And when the ruling dropped, it didn't just clear her name, it locked the door behind her. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The envelope sat crooked on Ruth Alton's welcome mat, too official to ignore and too heavy to belong in an ordinary day. A cream rectangle stamped with the seal of the Mecklenburg County Superior Court, the kind of thing that never brought good news. She stood there in her slippers, the late morning light slicing through the blinds across the narrow hallway, turning the dust in the air to gold. Her fingers hesitated only a second before she picked it up. The paper inside rasped as she unfolded it. Petition for financial misappropriation and inheritance dispute. The letters looked unreal, like someone else's nightmare printed in government font. Beneath the heading, two names were typed in all caps: Megan Alton Tyler Alton, her children. The muscles in Ruth's jaw tightened. She didn't speak, didn't curse, didn't cry. Instead, she read it again, line by line, as if scanning an old tax audit for missing decimals. The accusation was blunt. She'd hidden assets from the Alton family trust, mismanaged estate funds, and defrauded her own kin. Defrauded, she murmured under her breath. The word felt absurd on her tongue, like wearing someone else's shoes. The grandfather clock ticked beside her, an heirloom she'd dusted every week since her own grandfather's funeral. Ruth folded the petition neatly, aligning the edges with mathematical precision. She set it on the kitchen counter beside the teapot, as if it were any other piece of paperwork requiring her attention. The only betrayal in her face was a faint, deliberate smirk. Not of amusement, but calculation. She turned toward the hallway closet, the one her children had never thought to open when they came by for birthdays or Mother's Day, pretending to care. Inside hung an orderly row of coats, winter to spring, and below them, a black lockbox the size of a small briefcase. She crouched, knees popping softly, and drew it out. The metal felt cold through her palms. The combination dial clicked in familiar rhythm. 2471. Her anniversary, long erased from anyone else's memory. The lid opened with a hiss of stale air. Inside lay documents sealed in plastic sleeves, labeled and cross-referenced like the ledgers she used to keep at the accounting firm. Alton Land Trust, established 1987, amended 2001, final codicil 2012. She touched the papers as if greeting old friends. Each sheet bore the neat, slanted signature of her grandfather, Edward Alton, a man who believed in record-keeping as a moral principle. There were signatures, seals, notary stamps, all perfectly in order. The truth, pressed flat and waiting. Her heart steadied. Not a tremor of fear, only the quiet pulse of resolve. She closed the box but left it unlocked this time. No more secrets. The kitchen clock blinked 11:14 a.m. Ruth crossed to the landline phone on the wall, an antique rotary she never replaced. She dialed a number from memory, each click echoing softly through the empty house. The ringing stretched long enough for her to look out the window at her tidy front yard, the azaleas trimmed, the flagstone path clean. She'd built this calm one-line item at a time, while her children chased appearances and quick wins. A voice answered, gravelly and measured. Lester Miles. Ruth exhaled for the first time since opening the envelope. Lester, it's Ruth. They finally did it. A pause. Then a low sigh, the kind that carried decades of understanding. I wondered when that letter would come. They're claiming misappropriation. I figured. She could almost see him, sitting in that book-lined office downtown, glasses halfway down his nose, coffee cooling beside an open file. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Ruth's eyes drifted back to the counter where the petition lay like an insult waiting to be answered. "I want to do what I've always done," she said quietly. "Follow the numbers." Lester chuckled once, dry and knowing. "Then you'd better bring me that box." "I'll be there in the morning." She hung up, and the dial tone hummed in the silence. For a moment, Ruth stood perfectly still. Outside, a mail truck clattered down the street, and a neighbor's dog barked somewhere unseen. The ordinary sounds of the neighborhood pressed against her calm like small waves against a stone. Then she looked at the envelope again, still resting by the teapot, and whispered to no one, "You should have known better, Megan." Her gaze hardened. The sunlight caught the edge of the lockbox as she carried it to the kitchen table, setting it down like evidence before a jury only she could see. Ruth Alton straightened her shoulders, poured herself a cup of tea, and opened a fresh notepad. Across the top of the first page she wrote in firm strokes, "Response strategy, Alton v. Alton." And as she drew the first bullet point, the faintest smile ghosted across her face. The smile of a woman who'd been underestimated one time too many. Morning mist hung over downtown Charlotte like breath on glass, softening the edges of the skyline. Ruth drove the 15 minutes from Plaza Midwood in silence, the lockbox buckled into the passenger seat like a companion she trusted more than blood. Her silver sedan moved through the city with the same deliberate precision she brought to everything. Measured. Speed, steady lane changes, no wasted motion. Lester Miles's office was on the third floor of an old brick building that smelled faintly of coffee, books, and polished wood. His name still sat on the frosted glass door in gold lettering, the paint worn thin by time. Ruth paused before entering, smoothing the front of her charcoal coat, then stepped inside. Lester looked up from a stack of files. His gray hair was combed straight back, his tie loose but not careless. "Morning, Ruth." "Morning." He nodded toward the box. "That what I think it is?" She set it on his desk without a word. The lock clicked open, and the air filled with the faint scent of paper and metal. The past, preserved. Lester adjusted his glasses and began flipping through the sleeves, his fingers steady but his eyes sharp. Each page made a soft whisper as he turned it. 12 years, he said finally. "You kept this buried." "I kept it safe," Ruth replied. He smiled faintly. "There's a difference, but I'm not complaining." He held up one of the trust documents to the light. "Original notary seal, correct filing code, witness signatures match. They have no case." Ruth folded her hands on the edge of the desk. "They'll fight dirty anyway." "They always do," Lester said, leaning back in his chair. "But dirt only sticks if you lie down in it." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "You sound like my grandfather." "I take that as a compliment." He slid the papers back into their sleeves, each motion crisp. "The codicil alone closes every door they could try to pry open. We'll file a motion to dismiss before they realize how airtight this is." He tapped the lid of the box lightly. "They won't see this coming." Ruth's eyes drifted to the window, where the city's reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. "I don't think they see much of anything beyond what they want." Lester studied her for a moment. Not as a client, but as an old colleague who'd once balanced a dozen ledgers while raising 2 kids on one income. "You're not angry," he said. "You're just settled." "Anger's a waste," Ruth said quietly. "Numbers tell the truth. People lie." Lester chuckled under his breath. "Then we'll fight cleaner and harder." Ruth's gaze returned to him, calm and razor-sharp. "Just make sure it hurts where it should." He smiled, slow and deliberate. "Oh, it will." By early evening, the sunlight through Ruth's living room windows had turned amber, soft on the framed photos lining the mantel. None of them were new. Megan's graduation, Tyler's first baseball trophy. The three of them at the lake house the summer before her divorce. All frozen versions of love that had long since fractured. A gentle knock sounded at the back door. Only one person used that entrance anymore. Pamela Jordan stepped in, clutching a grocery bag and a smile that reached her eyes. Her silver curls framed a face that could toggle between laughter and scolding in an instant. "I brought you dinner. You look like you've been living on caffeine and vengeance," she said, setting the bag down. Ruth's lips curved. "You're not far off." Pamela unpacked 2 containers of chicken salad and sweet tea. "So, Lester's on board?" "As always," Ruth replied. Pamela's tone softened. "They really did it, huh? Suing their own mother." Ruth said nothing. The silence answered for her. Pamela sighed, sitting across from her at the table. "You gave them everything you could that wasn't nailed down, and they always wanted more than love." The words hung in the air, weighty and true. Ruth looked down at her hands, at the faint ink smudge from taking notes earlier. "They'll learn what wanting gets them." Pamela reached across, squeezed her hand once, firm and warm. "Just don't let this turn you mean." "I won't," Ruth said. "Mean would be easy. I'm going for precise." Outside, dusk settled over the neighborhood. The porch light flicked on automatically, bathing the walkway in a steady glow. Ruth stood and went to the counter, her eyes catching the envelope still sitting there, the petition that started it all. She didn't touch it this time. She simply stared at it, a faint, knowing calm in her expression. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "Let them come." The first chill of autumn had settled over Charlotte by the time the summons for the preliminary hearing arrived. The courthouse, a gray granite box of authority, loomed over the downtown square like it had seen every kind of greed the city could produce, and was still unimpressed. Ruth sat at the defense table beside Lester Miles, the lockbox now reduced to a slim folder in front of him. Across the aisle, Megan and Tyler whispered furiously to their new attorney, a woman whose very posture suggested the taste for combat. Heather Sparks. Heather was exactly what her reputation promised: sleek navy suit, pearl earrings, eyes like cut glass. She didn't so much stand as occupy space. Her voice, when she introduced herself to the judge, carried the crisp certainty of someone who believed she could bend a courtroom to her will. "Your Honor," she began, "we are petitioning for an immediate freeze on Mrs. Alton's liquid assets, pending forensic review of potential mismanagement." Ruth didn't flinch. She'd spent 30 years auditing people like Heather, women who weaponized confidence and paperwork in equal measure. Lester didn't blink either. He merely uncapped his pen, made a small note, and waited for his turn. Heather continued, pacing slightly. "Our clients have reason to believe significant portions of their grandfather's estate were diverted without documentation or oversight. Until clarity is achieved, funds must remain inaccessible." Judge Valerie Knox, silver hair, measured eyes, and a reputation for slicing through theatrics, leaned back in her chair. "You're asking me to freeze the entire trust?" Heather smiled. "Temporarily, for accountability's sake." Lester rose slowly, smoothing the front of his suit jacket. "Your Honor, if accountability is the goal, then allow me to provide some." He handed the clerk a neatly bound packet of documents. "Motion to dismiss, with prejudice." Heather turned, her composure tightening. "Dismiss? Before discovery?" "Yes," Lester said simply. "Because there's nothing to discover." Judge Knox arched an eyebrow, scanning the top page. "Counselor Miles, that's quite the statement." He nodded. "Ma'am, every financial record, tax return, and title transfer relevant to this trust is attached and notarized. Mrs. Alton's grandfather left behind a paper trail you could navigate by compass. The plaintiff's claims amount to conjecture, dressed up as concern." Heather's jaw ticked once. "You're implying—" I'm proving, Lester cut in, voice even but sharp. A small rustle went through the courtroom. Megan's face hardened, her manicured nails digging crescents into her palm. Tyler sat beside her, his knee bouncing under the table. Ruth remained motionless, her eyes fixed ahead, every inch of her calm, deliberate. Heather regrouped. Your Honor, this defense is premature. We've yet to conduct formal depositions. Then file your depositions, Judge Knox said evenly, flipping through the packet. But the motion to dismiss will be reviewed concurrently. Ruth watched the exchange like someone studying a chessboard. No emotion, just recognition of moves. When the gavel rapped a recess, she rose quietly, smoothing her skirt. Pamela, seated 2 rows behind, leaned forward and whispered as Ruth passed. She doesn't blink when she's cornered. Ruth gave the faintest smile. Corners are where I start counting. In the hallway, fluorescent lights hummed above the polished floors. Heather's voice carried, low and sharp, as she scolded Megan and Tyler near the vending machines. I can't work miracles if your mother's got the entire record sealed in her favor. Did either of you think she might be 2 steps ahead? Megan's face flushed red. She's just lucky, that's all. Heather shook her head. Luck doesn't notarize signatures. Tyler shoved his hands into his pockets, muttering, So what now? Heather's answer was cool, almost surgical. Now, we drag her through every inch of procedure until she cracks. Lester appeared beside Ruth a moment later, a legal pad tucked under his arm. They're going to play delay games, emotional leverage. Don't bite. Ruth's gaze followed her children. The way Megan's jaw tightened, the way Tyler's shoulders sagged. They already bit, she said quietly. I'm just not bleeding. That evening, back in Plaza Midwood, Ruth sat at her kitchen table under the low hum of the overhead light. The house was silent except for the creak of old wood and the faint crinkle of legal paper. She flipped through her own notes, the columns neat and color-coded. Every date, every form, every dollar accounted for. It wasn't just defense. It was proof of a life built by discipline, not inheritance. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the neighborhood. Ruth took a sip of cooled tea, her reflection faint in the window. Her phone buzzed with a new notification. An email alert from Lester. The subject line read, Hearing scheduled. Full review, 2 weeks. Ruth's pulse stayed steady as she closed the laptop. The storm outside deepened, wind pushing against the glass. She whispered, almost as if addressing the wind itself, Let's see what they do under pressure. The hum of Ruth's old printer filled the house like a mechanical heartbeat. One by one, pages slid out onto the dining room table. Statements, ledgers, check registers. 22 years of numbers, all in neat columns, all telling the story no courtroom gossip could distort. Outside, rain streaked the windows, the storm still lingering from the night before. Inside, Ruth had turned her modest home into an archive, folders arranged in symmetrical stacks, binder clips aligned like military ranks. She worked with the unhurried precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime balancing other people's chaos. The kitchen clock ticked past 9. Lester's voice came through her speakerphone, deep and steady. You're really printing every year? I don't half-fight, Lester, she said, slipping another page onto the growing pile. If they want to play accountant, I'll give them an education. A soft chuckle. This is how you win. Paper, not panic. Ruth smiled faintly, hearing the warmth behind his words. You always said that. I always meant it. His tone shifted slightly, serious now. I've seen families fold under less. Don't let their noise get under your skin. Noise can't touch arithmetic, she said. By noon, every flat surface in her house was covered. The dining table with bank statements, the sofa with CPA summaries, even the coffee table stacked with handwritten ledgers from the early years of her consulting work. Ruth had kept it all. She always did. She paused to sip her tea, eyes scanning the pages. There it was. A simple line item from 2012, her grandfather's signature on the trust's final filing. The ink had faded, but the intent hadn't. She traced it gently with her fingertip, like acknowledging an old promise. Across town, in Megan's glossy condo, a very different kind of work was happening. Megan sat cross-legged on her white leather couch, phone angled perfectly, light ring casting her in sympathetic glow. Her caption typed out in brisk, performative taps. "We're just protecting what's ours. Family should honor legacy, not hide it." The post went live with 3 hashtags: Kanak Family First, Kaishik Justice for Grandpa, Kaish Alton Legacy. Within minutes, the likes began rolling in. Megan watched the little hearts bloom across her screen with the same satisfaction Ruth reserved for balanced columns. "Optics," she muttered, tossing her hair. "It's all optics." Tyler, meanwhile, was on his 3rd bourbon at a sports bar uptown, updating his dating profile. He replaced project manager with future inheritance holder. He laughed to himself, as if saying it made it true. When the bartender glanced over, Tyler raised his glass. "Family's complicated," he said, like it was a punchline that made sense. By late afternoon, Ruth's printer gave a final wheeze of exhaustion. The last sheet landed in the tray, and she exhaled slowly, a sound halfway between relief and readiness. Her house looked like a command center. She sat amid the stacks, highlighting key dates and signatures, the soft yellow ink glowing under the lamp. Every line was an answer waiting for a question her children didn't yet know how to ask. When she reached the last binder, she stopped. Inside was her grandfather's old tax notebook, handwritten calculations, margin notes in blocky penmanship. In the back, he'd written a simple phrase in faded blue ink: "Keep your proof close, your heart closer." Ruth closed the notebook and sat back, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. Her phone buzzed. A text from Lester. "Lester. Forensic accountants in. Certified expert. We'll have them pick apart every claim." She typed back. "Ruth. Good. Let them drown in their own math." That evening, Pamela dropped by unannounced, umbrella dripping on the porch. Ruth let her in, motioning to the table. "Good Lord," Pamela breathed. "You could bury a person under all this." "Only metaphorically," Ruth said. Pamela chuckled, shaking her umbrella dry. "You know, there's something poetic about you printing their defeat in black and white." "Poetic isn't my goal," Ruth said. "Permanent is." They shared a quiet moment, the kind only old friends can have. Half empathy, half admiration. Then Pamela nodded toward the clock. "So what happens now?" Ruth looked over the mountain of documents, her expression unreadable. "Now," she said, "they realize I don't lose track of anything. Not money, not memory." A crack of thunder rolled again outside, distant but deliberate like punctuation. Ruth rose, gathered the first stack, and began filing it into a labeled box marked Evidence Primary. Each click of the clasp echoed through the quiet room. The pre-trial conference was supposed to be procedural, short, sterile, and forgettable. Instead, it felt like the air itself was waiting to be broken. Judge Valerie Knox presided with her usual calm authority, her reading glasses perched low, her gaze cutting through posturing like sunlight through smoke. The conference room wasn't the grand courtroom, just polished wood, legal pads, and the faint smell of burnt coffee from the machine in the corner. Still, every word carried the gravity of something about to tip. Ruth sat perfectly still beside Lester Miles, her posture immaculate, her hands folded on the table. Across from her, Heather Sparks radiated restless confidence, her pen tapping against the table like a ticking clock. Megan and Tyler flanked her, both trying too hard to look composed. Megan with her spine straight and lips pressed thin, Tyler fiddling with his watch band. Lester began quietly, without the showmanship Heather expected. "Your Honor," he said, sliding a thick document across the table. "We'd like to enter a late submission, an amended codicil to the Alton Family Trust, executed 3 days before Edward Alton's passing." Heather's brows lifted, a faint smirk curling her lips. "Late submission? Convenient timing, don't you think?" Lester didn't react. "The document was filed privately with the original estate records, as per your county's probate protocol. It simply hasn't been reviewed until now because, well, it didn't need to be." Heather laughed once, sharp. "And I suppose this mystery codicil just happens to make your client look like a saint?" Lester pushed the document slightly closer to Judge Knox. "It doesn't make her anything she isn't already. Legitimate." The judge adjusted her glasses and began to read. The room went silent except for the soft rustle of paper. Megan leaned forward, her eyes darting over the text. Her lipstick looked too bright under the fluorescent lights. "Wait," she said, her voice tightening. "This says, there are no fallback heirs." Tyler frowned, confusion bleeding into fear. "What does that mean?" "It means," Lester said evenly, "that your mother was designated as the sole beneficiary of the Alton Trust, explicitly. No secondary heirs, no residual claimants." Heather stood. "Your Honor, this is unverified and likely fabricated." Lester tilted his head slightly, unamused. "Be careful, counselor." Heather turned to the judge. "We move to strike this so-called codicil from record. There's no guarantee of authenticity." Judge Knox didn't respond immediately. She lifted the final page, her expression unreadable. "You're challenging the verification?" "Yes," Heather said. "The notarization could be falsified. The stamp looks digital. And the date—" her voice faltered. "Because the date was there in black ink, bold and irrefutable. October 14th, 2012, 3 days before Daniel Alton's funeral." Megan's face drained of color. "No, that can't be right." Tyler blinked hard, the denial rising in his throat before the thought formed. "You forged this." He spat at Ruth, his tone cracking. You made this up to cut us out." Ruth didn't even turn her head. Her eyes stayed fixed on the judge, her voice low but steady. "You think I'd forge my grandfather's signature? You didn't even know how he signed his name." Heather stepped forward. "Your Honor, I request the document be sent for verification before it's admitted. We cannot proceed on assumptions." Judge Knox studied the seal. Her finger traced the embossed edge, the faint shimmer of the notary mark catching the light. Then she picked up the page again, leaning closer. And for the first time since the proceedings began, her face shifted. A small, incredulous smile. "Counselor Sparks," she said, her voice deliberate. "There's no need for external verification." Heather froze. "Excuse me?" Judge Knox looked directly at her. "That's my signature on this codicil. I notarized it." The room fell silent. Even the hum of the overhead light seemed to hesitate. Heather blinked, completely disarmed. Megan's mouth opened, but no sound came. Tyler's fingers twitched against the table. Ruth finally turned her head, not toward them, but toward the judge. "Then I believe we're finished questioning its authenticity." Judge Knox straightened the pages, her tone cool but absolute. "It would appear so." Heather sank back into her chair, her usual armor cracking around the edges. Lester allowed himself the smallest exhale of satisfaction, a glance toward Ruth that said checkmate. Pamela, seated quietly at the back of the room, let out a single whisper only Ruth could hear. "They didn't see that coming." Ruth didn't answer. Her gaze stayed forward, serene and unyielding, as if she'd known all along that the past would defend her. The judge set the document aside and tapped her gavel once, not to end the meeting, but to punctuate the moment. The hearing resumed 2 days later, but the courtroom energy had changed. The swagger that had followed Heather Sparks and her clients through the first sessions was gone, replaced by unease so thick Ruth could almost feel it in the air. Megan sat rigid at the plaintiff's table, jaw clenched so tightly a faint muscle flickered at her temple. Tyler slouched beside her, pale and restless, avoiding his mother's eyes. Heather tried to command her usual confidence, flipping through a binder with performative intent, but the gestures were empty. The codicil had detonated their case from the inside. Judge Valerie Knox entered with her usual poise, her robe flowing behind her like a dark tide. She didn't glance toward Ruth as she took her seat, but the air shifted when she spoke. Before we begin, I will remind all parties that emotional outbursts and personal accusations have no place in this courtroom. Her voice was calm but edged with warning. This case concerns legal documentation, not family drama. Heather rose first, trying to regain control. Your Honor, in light of the newly verified codicil, my clients wish to withdraw their motion to freeze Mrs. Alton's assets. Granted, Judge Knox replied immediately, then added with the faintest curve of irony, I assume this is to prevent further embarrassment? A few quiet chuckles rippled through the gallery before the gavel's sharp tap silenced them. Heather's smile was tight. We believe it's the prudent step, Your Honor. Of course you do, the judge said, setting the document aside. Proceed. Across the aisle, Ruth remained still. She didn't look triumphant. If anything, she looked analytical, as though this, too, was another item in her ledger finally balancing. Heather turned to Megan and Tyler, whispering something urgent. Megan shook her head, her composure fracturing. No, she hissed, voice carrying. I don't care what it says. She manipulated him. He was sick, and she knew it. The courtroom's murmur thickened. Tyler added, louder than he realized. She's been planning this for years. Judge Knox's gavel struck hard. Enough. Both siblings froze. The judge's expression cooled to steel. If either of you speak out of turn again, I will hold you in contempt. Do you understand me? Megan's lips parted, but no sound came. Tyler sank lower in his seat, face flushed. Heather swallowed, clearly fighting irritation. Your Honor, my clients are... They are out of line, Knox interrupted. Sit down, counselor. You can't cross-examine bad behavior. From the defense table, Lester almost smiled. He adjusted his glasses, leaned toward Ruth, and murmured just loud enough for her to hear. It's like watching amateurs short their own stock. Ruth didn't smile, but a flicker of amusement touched her eyes. Then let's collect the dividends, she said softly. He nodded, opening his briefcase. Already on it. As the plaintiff scrambled to regain footing, Lester began drafting a new motion. One few expected at this stage. He wrote with quiet purpose, the scratching of his pen deliberate. Ruth watched him, calm but alert. Heather noticed. What's that? She asked sharply. Motion for damages, Lester said, without looking up. False claim, reputational harm, emotional distress, and recovery of legal fees. Heather's voice faltered. You can't. I can, Lester replied smoothly. And I will. The judge looked intrigued. File it by end of day, Counselor Miles. I'll review it personally. Megan's hand flew to her mouth. This isn't fair. Judge Knox turned toward her. What isn't fair, Ms. Alton, is dragging your mother through a baseless claim built on assumption and vanity. You should be grateful this isn't a criminal filing for perjury. The silence that followed was merciless. When the session adjourned, Ruth gathered her things with practiced grace. Megan and Tyler stayed seated, eyes fixed on the table, their attorney whispering damage control that sounded more like apology. Outside, the October air was crisp and sunlit, the courthouse steps gleaming from the earlier rain. Ruth walked down them alone, the weight in her chest finally lifting, though she would never admit it aloud. She crossed the street to a small cafe, the same one she and Lester had frequented years ago when she still filed client ledgers by hand. The bell over the door jingled softly. She ordered black coffee and took a window seat, her reflection merging with the courthouse across the street. For the first time in weeks, she let herself breathe. The steam rose in slow curls and she smiled, not wide, not proud, just quiet. She defended her name with proof, not passion. Pamela arrived moments later, sliding into the opposite seat with a knowing grin. I heard the fireworks. Lester did most of the lighting, Ruth said, stirring her cup. Pamela leaned in. Don't gloat yet, honey. You're not done. People like them, they don't stop when they're wrong. They stop when they're exposed. Ruth's smile deepened slightly. Then I guess it's time to turn on the lights. Outside, clouds drifted past the courthouse dome, and Ruth's reflection hardened, no longer just calm, but resolute. The notice came on a Monday morning, thin white envelope, county seal. Ruth sliced it open with her letter opener and read it without changing expression. The plaintiffs, now flailing for traction, had requested a capacity evaluation. The claim that Ruth, 70 years old, might not have been of sound mind when handling the estate's finances. It would have been laughable if it weren't so predictable. By Wednesday, Ruth was seated in a beige office that smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee grounds. Diplomas lined the wall, neat and unthreatening. Across from her sat Dr. Alan Pierce, the first of two appointed neurospecialists. He smiled the way people do when they expect frailty. This shouldn't take long, Mrs. Alton. Just a few cognitive assessments, some questions about memory and decision-making. Ruth folded her hands on her lap. Ask whatever you like. I've been balancing books longer than you've been writing prescriptions. He chuckled softly, but the humor didn't quite land. The session began. Memory recall, arithmetic under time limits, scenario reasoning. Ruth moved through each with the same calm precision she'd used to untangle tax ledgers for decades. When Dr. Pierce asked her to count backward by sevens, she raised an eyebrow. You want me to do that from a lifetime of reconciling accounts? I could do it to the sound of your clock ticking. He smiled again, this time more genuinely. At the end of the hour, he flipped his notes closed. Mrs. Alton, I can tell you now, your cognition is not just intact, it's exceptional. Ruth rose, smoothing her jacket. You'll put that in writing, I assume? Absolutely. The second evaluation, 3 days later, was conducted by Dr. Yvonne Clark, younger, sharper, and less inclined toward condescension. She asked about decision-making during stress. Ruth's answers were measured but not rehearsed. I don't panic under pressure. I list, I prioritize, then I solve. Panic wastes time. Time loses money. Dr. Clark studied her for a moment before nodding. I'd call that executive function at its finest. When it was over, Ruth left the clinic and drove home through the crisp Charlotte afternoon. Windows cracked to let the wind push through. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and exhaust. Alive, ordinary, grounding. Her phone buzzed before she'd even reached the house. It was Lester. They're both in, he said. Written confirmation from 2 independent specialists. Full cognitive capacity. No grounds for incompetence. Ruth parked in her driveway, staring out at the tidy lawn she'd kept immaculate for decades. Then they just tried to paint their mother senile in public, she said softly. Lester exhaled. They're not strategizing anymore. They're grasping. Then let's make it the last thing they ever grab. 2 days later, in Judge Knox's courtroom, the reports were entered into record. The judge flipped through them, her expression dry as desert sand. Dr. Pierce, she read aloud, finds Mrs. Alton's cognitive capacity fully intact, demonstrating superior executive functioning. Dr. Clark concurs, quote, no impairment whatsoever. She lowered the documents with a faint sigh. Frankly, this is insulting. Mrs. Alton has displayed more composure and clarity than anyone else in this courtroom. Heather shifted in her seat. Your Honor, my clients were simply grasping at straws. Judge Knox interrupted. I'm aware. She looked down at the plaintiffs. You owe your mother an apology, not another motion. Megan leaned in toward Heather, whispering something sharp enough to sting. Heather's face tightened, but she didn't reply. Tyler, meanwhile, sat frozen, jaw slack. The hollow look of someone realizing the tide had finally turned. Lester stood. Your Honor, given the repetitive and baseless nature of these filings, the defense moves to bar any further claims unless new, verifiable evidence is presented. Judge Knox didn't hesitate. Motion granted. Her gavel cracked once, clean and final. Heather blinked. Your Honor, I said granted, Counselor. And just like that, the courtroom's noise deflated into silence. Ruth allowed herself one deep, steady breath. This wasn't joy. It was vindication tempered with exhaustion. She turned slightly, meeting Lester's eyes. He gave a small nod. No celebration, just acknowledgement. That evening, back at her kitchen table, Ruth opened the heavy binder containing her trust documents. The lamplight caught the gold edge of her reading glasses as she wrote a new clause, each word deliberate. Any party contesting this trust forfeits all rights, claims, and privileges, current or future. She initialed the page, closed the binder, and sealed it in the lockbox once again. Her pen still in hand, she murmured to herself, You don't get to rewrite what you didn't earn. The grandfather clock ticked behind her. Steady. Certain. Outside, a car idled at the corner before pulling away. Ruth didn't look up. She didn't need to. She knew they were watching, still hoping she'd slip. But Ruth Alton didn't slip. She documented. By the time the courtroom filled again, the Alton case had become local spectacle. Reporters lingered outside the courthouse steps. A freelance journalist had even called it a family feud with ledgers and lawyers instead of shotguns. Inside, Ruth Alton sat at the defense table, perfectly still, a pillar in soft gray wool and unshakable calm. Across the aisle, Megan looked hollow from lack of sleep, and Tyler's tie was crooked, a small but telling unraveling. Heather Sparks was still performing confidence, though her smile had the brittle sheen of a pane about to crack. Lester, as always, looked like a man with a secret he planned to reveal in perfect timing. Your Honor, he began smoothly, rising from his seat. The defense would like to call a witness not previously listed in pre-trial discovery, a man whose record-keeping and first-hand observation reach back nearly 25 years. Heather shot up. Objection, Your Honor. This is ambush testimony. Judge Knox didn't look fazed. Counselor Miles, I trust you can justify this deviation? Yes, ma'am, Lester said. The witness came forward voluntarily this week, upon reading public mention of this case. His testimony directly concerns the management of the Alton Trust properties and Mrs. Alton's role in maintaining them. Judge Knox leaned back, intrigued. Proceed. The court will allow it. Heather exhaled hard through her nose but sat down, glaring. Lester nodded to the bailiff. Defense calls Mr. James Corbett to the stand. A tall, weathered man stepped forward. Tan skin, sun-creased face, work boots polished more out of respect than habit. He adjusted his hat before handing it to the bailiff, then took his seat. Mr. Corbett, Lester began, please state your occupation for the record. Retired land surveyor, the man said. Worked 41 years for Alton Development and the County Zoning Commission before that. And how do you know Mrs. Ruth Alton? Corbett looked toward Ruth and offered a respectful nod. Met her back in 2001, just after her granddaddy passed. She was the only one who ever showed up at the zoning office herself. Brought her own paperwork. Neat, complete, color-coded tabs. Not once did she ask me to do something under the table. she said. If it ain't honest, it ain't Alton. A murmur drifted through the gallery. Heather stood. Your Honor, the witness's recollection of events from decades ago is anecdotal at best. Overruled, Judge Knox said, almost before she finished. The witness may continue. Corbett nodded politely. Anyway, I remember one thing clear as yesterday. It was tax season. Must have been '05 or '06. She'd mailed off the land use filings herself. Postage she bought at the counter while I was waiting behind her. Told the clerk she didn't trust the county's interoffice mail system to lose anything her granddaddy left her. He gave a faint smile. That's the kind of woman she is. Double checks the stamp, triple checks the copy. Heather shifted, visibly irritated. Mr. Corbett, are you being compensated by the defense for your appearance today? He chuckled. Only thing I've been offered is coffee and a handshake. A ripple of laughter spread through the courtroom, light but genuine. Judge Knox allowed herself the ghost of a smile. Continue, Mr. Corbett. Yes, ma'am. Point is, I've seen plenty of folks try to fake stewardship of land they don't understand. Mrs. Alton? She knew every parcel number by heart, even helped me correct a boundary error in the county's own files back in '09. That's not someone hiding assets. That's someone protecting them. He turned his gaze to Megan and Tyler. Your mother's the reason that trust even exists in full today. You'd be fighting over dust if she hadn't done her homework. Megan's face flushed crimson. Tyler shifted in his seat, hands clenched together, knuckles white. Heather rose again, desperate. Your Honor, I renew my objection. Speculative commentary. Overruled, Judge Knox said again, leaning back, eyes fixed on Corbett. The court finds the witness credible. Corbett nodded once. Thank you, ma'am. That's all I got. Lester smiled faintly. That was more than enough, Mr. Corbett. When the witness stepped down, the silence in the courtroom was heavy but alive, not the silence of boredom, but of gravity settling where noise used to live. Ruth didn't move, didn't smile, didn't even glance at her children. Her composure was its own kind of verdict. Judge Knox folded her hands, the faintest warmth in her eyes. Mr. Corbett, thank you for your service, both to this county and to truth. As the old surveyor left, Heather leaned toward Megan, whispering furiously. Ruth didn't bother to listen. She was watching the judge instead, sensing the subtle shift. Respect, not pity, had entered the room. When court adjourned for the day, Megan stormed out without looking back. Tyler followed, shoulders hunched, like a boy leaving detention. Lester packed up his notes in silence. Pamela, sitting in the back row, caught Ruth's eye and mouthed, They're coming apart. Ruth finally allowed herself a breath. Then, without a word, she stood, lifted her bag, and walked out into the cool afternoon light. Not triumphant, not vengeful, simply undefeated. The courthouse hallway smelled faintly of polish and rain-soaked coats. The storm outside had returned, drumming against the glass as Lester Miles filed a new stack of documents with the clerk's office. Heavier, sharper, final. Ruth stood beside him, her umbrella folded at her side. You're sure you want to go through with it? She asked quietly. Lester's expression was calm, almost kind. They made this public. They accused you of theft, deceit, and mental incompetence, all without evidence. This isn't revenge, Ruth. It's accountability. He slid the stamped motion across the counter. Countersuit. Reputational damages and legal abuse. Ruth read the title once, her jaw setting with quiet finality. Then let's make it official. The clerk nodded, affixing the docket number with a satisfying stamp that echoed through the tiled hall. 3 days later, the case reappeared before Judge Valerie Knox. Same courtroom, same wood-paneled walls, but an entirely different power dynamic. Heather Sparks looked smaller than usual at her table, her once flawless composure now a little frayed. Megan sat beside her, eyes rimmed with sleepless circles. Tyler looked like he'd aged years and weeks. Judge Knox began without ceremony. The court has reviewed the defense's motion for reputational damages. Given the merit of Mrs. Alton's original documentation and the plaintiff's repeated introduction of unfounded claims, I am accepting this countersuit for hearing under the same docket. The words hit like a physical impact. Heather straightened in protest. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. It's called balance, Judge Knox replied coolly. You wanted this courtroom, counselor. Now you have to stay in it. Across the aisle, Ruth didn't move. Only her hands shifted, folding neatly atop her notepad. Heather turned to Megan and Tyler in a low whisper. We'll counter this. PR first. Legal second. But even as she spoke, the damage was already spilling beyond the courthouse walls. That evening, Megan sat in her condo surrounded by the hollow glow of her own social media posts. Every caption, every performative defense of family legacy now looked cheap, desperate. She clicked delete again and again, erasing her curated outrage, the comments section full of pity and mockery. Family First had become a punchline. Her phone buzzed. It was an email from her firm. Mandatory meeting, conduct review. She didn't open it right away. She knew what it meant. Meanwhile, Tyler sat alone in his apartment, the walls bare except for a crooked diploma. He scrolled through local news, seeing his name mentioned next to the words, frivolous litigation. His friends weren't answering his texts. Finally, unable to stand the silence, he called his mother. Ruth answered on the third ring. Hello, Tyler. There was a pause, long, hollow, uncertain. Mom, he said softly, his voice stripped of its usual bravado. Can we talk privately? Please. Just not about the case. Just us. Ruth stared out her window, watching rain slide down the glass. She wanted to remember him as a boy, the way he'd used to laugh when his shoelaces came undone. But the image had faded under too many choices he'd made himself. I think everything that needed saying, she replied evenly, has already been said. In court. Mom. Good night, Tyler. She ended the call. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the phone down, but her face never changed. The next morning, Megan arrived at her firm's downtown office in a trench coat, hair pulled into a tight bun, clutching a folder like a shield. The receptionist wouldn't meet her eyes. Inside the conference room, 3 partners waited. The youngest cleared his throat. Megan, we're letting you go. Her mouth fell open. What? After 15 years? Your public behavior, the lawsuit, the media posts, it reflects poorly on the firm. Our clients expect discretion, not spectacle. This is absurd, she said, voice rising. My personal life is no longer private, the senior partner interrupted. We've drafted a statement, public behavior unbecoming, effective immediately. The words echoed, heavy and unreal. She gathered her things in silence, the sound of rain against the windows the only applause for her downfall. When she reached the elevator, her reflection in the metal doors looked unfamiliar. Thinner, harsher, all angles and no warmth. Back in Plaza Midwood, Ruth was pruning her front hedge when Lester's car pulled into the drive. He stepped out holding an umbrella and a small smile. Thought you'd want to hear it from me, he said. The firm dropped Megan. Officially. Ruth paused, shears in hand. What about Tyler? He's quiet, Lester replied, but for once that might be his smartest move. The rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and cool. Ruth looked at the small clippings of green at her feet, the tidy edges where chaos used to spill over. Then maybe they're learning, she said softly. Lester watched her a moment longer. You think they'll stop now? Ruth met his gaze. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between peace and prophecy. No, she said finally. They'll get desperate. The clouds parted briefly, sunlight spilling across her yard like a warning. The morning the letters arrived, the sky was too bright for winter, a sharp Carolina blue that felt almost mocking. Ruth found the first envelope wedged in her mailbox, her name written in Tyler's sloppy handwriting, half cursive, half regret. The second came digitally, Megan's email, long enough to scroll through like a manifesto. Ruth carried the letter inside and set it beside her coffee mug. The air smelled faintly of rain from the night before, and the lavender soap she'd used on the counters. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet she used to dream about. She poured her coffee, took one sip, and opened Tyler's envelope. Inside was a handwritten apology on cheap stationery, the kind you bought in packs of 10. "Mom," it began. "I messed up. I didn't mean for any of this to go as far as it did. Megan said it was about fairness, and I believed her. I guess I wanted to believe I hadn't already lost your trust a long time ago." There were more lines, about pressure, about shame, about how the money had twisted things. Near the end, he'd written, "If you can forgive me, maybe we can start over. Just dinner. Just family." Ruth read it twice, then once more, not because she didn't understand, but because she wanted to feel something, anything. But all she felt was a cool detachment, the same calm she'd clung to in every courtroom session, every accusation, every sleepless night spent choosing reason over rage. She folded the letter neatly, set it aside, and opened her laptop. Megan's email blinked at the top of her inbox. Subject: "Can we talk?" Ruth clicked. The email began as an apology and ended as an accusation. Megan wrote about stress, about bad legal advice, about public perception, everything except remorse. "You know how social media twists things," Megan had typed. "It wasn't about hurting you, it was about protecting what's ours. You raised me to be strong, and maybe I took that too far." Ruth reached the final paragraph. "If you'd just meet with me privately, we can control this narrative before it defines us. Family doesn't have to be this way. Control. Narrative." Even in apology, Megan was managing optics. Ruth sat back in awe. Her chair, her jaw tight. When Lester stopped by that afternoon, his briefcase in one hand, a folder of case updates in the other, she handed both letters to him. He adjusted his glasses, skimmed Tyler's first, then the email. By the time he reached the end, he looked almost amused. "They're not sorry," he said softly. "They're cornered." Ruth poured him a cup of coffee and waited. "So what would you do with them?" He set the pages down. "Trash it all. There's no peace in letting people rewrite their sins as misunderstandings." Ruth nodded slowly, as if she'd been waiting for permission. She walked to the shredder in the corner of her study. A sturdy old machine she used for tax records and bank drafts. She fed Tyler's letter in first. The paper disappeared in thin strips, the whirring noise sharp and final. Then came the printout of Megan's email. Line by line, sentence by sentence, it vanished until only dust and static remained. When the machine quieted, Lester said, "Feel better?" Ruth looked at the empty shredder bin. "Lighter," she said. He smiled. "Good." After he left, Pamela came by with a tray of cornbread and that same knowing smirk she always wore when the world caught up to someone who deserved it. "So," she said, setting the tray down, "they've found religion, huh?" "Of a kind," Ruth replied dryly. Pamela sat across from her, folding her arms. "Now they remember you're their mother?" Ruth gave a quiet laugh, one that sounded more like air leaving a sealed jar. "They remember what they lost." Pamela tilted her head. "And you? What do you remember?" Ruth looked out through the window toward her garden. Rows of turned soil waiting for color. That peace costs more than pride, but it lasts longer. Later, as dusk thinned the light across her yard, Ruth stepped outside with a small crate of tulip bulbs. The ground was cool, pliable, forgiving. She knelt, her knees pressing into the earth, and began planting row by row. White, yellow, red. Each bulb a quiet punctuation mark to a chapter she'd chosen to end. As the last one went into the soil, Ruth brushed the dirt from her hands and whispered, "For closure, not forgiveness." Behind her, the porch light clicked on automatically, throwing a soft halo over her back. She stood, stretching, the air cool against her skin. The house looked peaceful again, the kind of peaceful no apology could ever buy back. The morning of the ruling broke clear and cold, the kind of sharp October light that made Charlotte's skyline look carved out of glass. Ruth arrived early, as always. She wore navy wool and the same pearl earrings she'd worn to her first day as a CPA decades ago. They'd always been her armor, understated, unshakable. The courthouse lobby buzzed with anticipation. Even the clerks seemed quieter than usual, like the building itself understood the day's wait. Ruth and Lester walked, side by side toward courtroom 3, their footsteps echoing against the marble floor. Lester's voice was low but certain. "It's the end game, Ruth. Judge Knox won't leave loose ends." "I don't need victory," Ruth replied. "Just closure." He smiled faintly. "You'll have both." When the courtroom doors opened, every seat filled within minutes. Reporters sat poised with notepads. Camera flashes stuttered through the back windows. On the other side, Megan sat rigid in a dark blazer that didn't quite fit, the gloss of her old confidence gone. Tyler leaned forward, pale and drawn, his eyes avoiding everyone's. Heather Sparks looked like a woman halfway through swallowing pride that wouldn't go down. Judge Valerie Knox entered at 9 sharp. Her black robe moved like calm thunder, her silver hair pinned tight, no nonsense in her gaze. "This court," she began, "has reviewed all evidence, testimonies, and filings in Alton versus Alton. I am prepared to issue my decision." A hush fell so complete that Ruth could hear the faint hum of the courtroom's lights. Knox continued. "The plaintiffs alleged misappropriation, concealment, and incompetence. They have failed to produce a single verifiable document supporting those claims." She lifted a sheet from her folder, the notarized codicil. "Conversely, the defense has provided overwhelming proof that Mrs. Ruth Alton is the sole and rightful heir to the Edward Alton Trust." Heather rose halfway. "Your Honor, if I may." "You may not," Knox said, her tone slicing through the room. "Sit down, counselor." Heather obeyed, lips pressed thin. "The codicil," the judge went on, "was executed and notarized on October 14, 2012. This court recognizes its validity and, effective immediately, declares Mrs. Ruth Alton the sole legal heir to the Alton Trust, retroactive to the date of execution." Megan inhaled sharply, a sound somewhere between disbelief and panic. Tyler's head dropped into his hands. Knox wasn't finished. "The plaintiff's repeated motions, despite lack of evidence and continued public defamation of the defendant, constitute legal abuse. Accordingly, I am ordering both Megan Alton and Tyler Alton to pay court costs and the defendant's legal fees in full." The gavel struck once. The sound reverberated like a gunshot. Heather started to speak again, but the judge cut her off with a raised hand. "No more motions, no appeals. Not in my courtroom. This matter is closed." She paused, looking down at the 2 adult children who had turned their inheritance into ammunition. Her voice softened, but only slightly. "One last note for the record," she said. "Family doesn't mean entitlement. It means stewardship, of love, of honor, and of truth. You lost sight of all 3. Then she turned her attention to Ruth. "Mrs. Alton, you are fully exonerated." Ruth inclined her head, her voice even. "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge nodded once. "I suspect your grandfather would be proud." The gavel fell again, final and echoing. Outside, the sun was blinding after the dim courtroom. Reporters surged forward, microphones raised, cameras flashing. Mrs. Alton, can we get a comment? Do you feel vindicated? Will you reconcile with your children? Ruth paused at the top of the courthouse steps, the marble gleaming beneath her sensible heels. Lester stood at her side, hand shielding her from the swarm. She met the reporter's eyes calmly, her voice steady but cool. There's nothing to reconcile when truth speaks for itself. Any message to your family? Someone shouted. Ruth hesitated, then said, yes. She looked past the crowd, past the questions, the flashes, the noise. Legacy isn't what you're given, it's what you guard. Then she turned and walked down the steps, the crowd parting instinctively around her. At the bottom, Pamela waited near a parked sedan, a scarf knotted against the breeze. Well? She asked, though she already knew. It's over, Ruth said softly. Pamela smiled. For them, maybe. For you, it's just beginning. Ruth looked down the street, sunlight reflecting off the glass towers like distant fire. You might be right, she murmured. A single leaf skittered across the pavement, chasing her as she stepped forward into the bright, cold morning. A woman no longer accused, but changed. The ink on Judge Knox's ruling had barely dried when Ruth began the next phase. Not defense, not retaliation, but design. 2 weeks later, she sat in Lester Miles's office beneath a high ceiling lined with old law books and dust-speckled sunlight. The lockbox that had once guarded her survival now sat open between them, not as evidence, but as the blueprint for something bigger. Lester leaned forward, flipping through fresh drafts on heavy linen paper. So this is what you want? Ruth nodded. Exactly that. 80% of the Alton property transferred to the Carolina Conservation Foundation. No sale, no subdivision. Permanent protection. He raised a brow, smiling faintly. You're giving away $40 million worth of land. Not giving, Ruth corrected. Preserving. My grandfather built it for stewardship, not greed. That lesson skipped a generation. I'm just restoring it. Lester leaned back, his chair creaking softly. And the other 20%? She handed him another folder, slimmer, more personal. The Alton Scholarship Fund, for working mothers going back to school. We'll start with the acreage near Providence Road, the one with the community zoning. Lester flipped through the pages, then closed them carefully, almost reverently. You realize this will make headlines. I'm counting on it, Ruth said. On the morning of the signing, Pamela was already in Ruth's kitchen by sunrise, arranging trays of muffins and folding crisp linen napkins. If your grandfather could see this, she said, he'd be toasting you with his morning bourbon. Ruth smirked. He'd also ask how much I kept. Pamela laughed, the sound bright against the hum of the coffee maker. He'd approve of the math. 80% conscience, 20% practical. Ruth looked out the window toward her backyard. The tulips she'd planted weeks ago were starting to push through the soil, green tips breaking the surface like quiet promises. He always said land isn't wealth, it's responsibility. I just want to pass that forward. Pamela placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Then let them write that down when they talk about you. By noon, the county clerk's conference room was filled with quiet movement, photographers adjusting lenses, reporters whispering, the subtle shuffle of papers. Ruth signed the documents one by one, her handwriting steady, deliberate. Lester stood beside her, reading each line as though the act itself sanctified it. When the final document was notarized, a journalist from the Charlotte Observer stepped forward. Mrs. Alton? She asked. After such a high-profile case, why make this decision? Ruth capped her pen, met the reporter's gaze, and smiled. Because legacy isn't ownership. It's what you leave standing after you're gone. The flashbulbs went off in quiet staccato. Pamela handed her a glass of water, whispering, "You just gave them their headline." By evening, the story had spread across state wires and social media feeds. Ear breaks line, gives legacy away. The next morning, Ruth's phone buzzed on the breakfast table. A text from an unknown number, though the number wasn't really unknown at all. It was Megan. Just one word. Why? Ruth stared at the screen for a long time, her reflection faint in the glass. The question was honest for once. Stripped of entitlement, stripped of spin. She typed nothing in reply. Instead, she set the phone face down beside her coffee cup and looked out through the kitchen window, where the early light hit the tulips just right. Yellow, white, red, alive. Pamela arrived moments later carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and a rolled-up copy of The Observer. "Your front page?" she said, tapping the headline. "You look like a saint and a general all at once." Ruth took the paper, studied the photo, herself beside the conservation trustees, smile measured, eyes unreadable. "Saints don't balance ledgers," she murmured. Pamela grinned. "No, but they do close accounts." Ruth folded the newspaper, slid it under her notebook, and finally allowed a small, private smile. Then maybe I'm both. That afternoon, she stood on the edge of the donated land, acres of pine and wild grass stretching out under a flawless sky. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of earth and freedom. Ruth closed her eyes and imagined her grandfather walking beside her, hat tilted, that old half-smile of approval ghosting his face. "You kept it safe," she whispered. The wind answered, soft and steady. As she turned back toward her car, her phone buzzed again. A voicemail this time, Megan's voice trembling through static. "Mom, please call me back. It's important." Ruth didn't press play. Not yet. She watched the horizon instead, sunlight turning the fields gold. The morning Lester called, Ruth was in her garden trimming back the tulips before the season turned. The soil still held the chill of early spring, and the air was threaded with the smell of rain-soaked earth. Her phone buzzed twice on the porch railing. "Morning, Ruth," Lester said when she answered. His voice carried that dry satisfaction that always meant he'd discovered something interesting. "You might want to sit down for this one." She wiped her hands on her gardening apron. "Lester, it's a little early for dramatics." He chuckled. "Remember how your grandfather structured the trust with mineral and subsurface rights separated from surface use? Of course. He was obsessed with protecting every inch beneath that land. Well, turns out that detail just paid off. Literally. A new state highway expansion project cut across 2 of the parcels you donated. The Department of Transportation subcontractor hit a natural gas seam. It triggered a dormant lease clause from the original trust." Ruth frowned. "And?" Lester let the pause linger, milking it. "And you're about to start receiving an annual payout of $480,000 in royalties." Ruth blinked once, her shears frozen midair. "That's impossible. I gave up the land." "You gave up the surface," Lester corrected, his voice now carrying the faintest grin. "Not the mineral rights. Your grandfather filed them separately in 1987, and they've remained yours under trust continuity. The state can't touch them." She sank slowly onto the porch step. The hum of distant traffic mingled with the soft chatter of birds in the trees. "So, all these years?" He finished for her. "It was sitting under your feet, waiting." For a long moment, Ruth didn't speak. The irony was exquisite. Her children had tried to claim what was visible, and what truly held value had always been hidden deep, unseen, and untouchable. "Send me the paperwork," she said finally. "I'll have it couriered this afternoon." "Good. Then set up a meeting. I want to restructure everything under a new holding company. Clean slate, full protection." Lester chuckled. "Already one step ahead of you. I've drafted the articles for Alton Equity Holdings. You'll retain full control, but you can assign limited partners if you'd like. Ruth's gaze drifted toward the open window where Pamela's laughter echoed faintly from the kitchen. She'd stopped by unannounced, as usual, bringing muffins and unsolicited advice. Assign one, Ruth said. Pamela Jordan, 10% ownership. Lester hesitated. 10% of nearly $500,000 a year? That's generous. She's earned it, Ruth replied simply. Loyalty deserves interest. He smiled through the phone line. You know, Ruth, most people win their wars by destroying what's left of the enemy. You build empires out of the rubble instead. Ruth's mouth curved into the faintest smile. Best revenge, she said, is doing it right. That afternoon, Lester arrived with the paperwork. They sat in the sunlit dining room, the same table that had once been covered in bank statements and legal drafts. Now it was clean. Just a pot of coffee, a pen, and 2 neat folders. As Ruth signed the documents, Pamela watched, wide-eyed. I still can't believe you're giving me a share of this. Believe it, Ruth said. You were there when everything fell apart. You helped me hold the line. This is just dividends on friendship. Pamela laughed softly. Then I guess I picked the right friend. Lester gathered the signed pages and placed them into his briefcase. Everything's secure now. They can't touch a dime of it. Good, Ruth said. Let it stay quiet. He glanced up. You mean, no public filing? Ruth shook her head. Not this time. Let the noise die where it belongs. In memory. That evening, Ruth sat alone in her living room, the twilight washing the walls in muted gold. The television hummed faintly in the background, local news replaying her interview from the land donation ceremony weeks before. Her image flickered across the screen. Calm, composed, unknowable. Her phone buzzed again. A notification from her finance app. Deposit, $40,000. First royalty payment, Q1. She smiled to herself. Numbers never lied. Then, as she reached to silence the screen, another notification appeared. One from her private bank account under a new name, Alton Equity Holdings, property purchase pending. Lester's note followed seconds later. Mortgage transfer confirmed. Mecklenburg Bank has released the lien. Ruth stared at the message, heart steady, lips curving slowly. She set her glass down on the arm of her chair. Across town, Megan sat at her dining table, staring at a letter from her mortgage lender. Notice of ownership transfer. Your account has been purchased by a private note holder. All future payments should be directed accordingly. She frowned, confused, a flicker of unease tightening her throat. In Plaza Midwood, Ruth looked out through her front window, the tulips swaying softly in the breeze. Her reflection in the glass looked older, calmer, and finally untouchable. She whispered to herself, control the debt, control the story. The wind outside carried the faint scent of spring, and with it, something like victory. Quiet, unseen, complete. The letter from the private note holder arrived at Megan's doorstep on the first Tuesday of April, tucked inside a plain white envelope that looked harmless enough to ignore. She didn't open it right away. It sat on her granite counter all afternoon while she took calls she could barely focus on and scrolled past listings of homes she could no longer sell. When she finally tore it open, the words hit her with the same cold finality as the court's gavel months ago. Payment past due, immediate remittance required. Below that, in neat black type, please contact your assigned account manager at Alton Equity Holdings, LLC. Megan's heart stuttered. The name looked familiar in the way something half-remembered from a dream does. Unplaceable, but waited. She turned the page over, looking for a human name. There wasn't one. Just an address, a P.O. box, and a warning. Failure to comply may result in foreclosure proceedings. She sank onto the kitchen stool, phone trembling in her hand as she called the number printed at the bottom. A clipped professional voice answered, Alton Equity Holdings, Client Services. This must be a mistake, Megan said, forcing her tone into the crisp authority she used on clients. I've never heard of your company. You bought my mortgage? Yes, ma'am, the voice said evenly. Your lender sold your account to us as part of a secondary portfolio acquisition. Your payment was due on the 15th. I paid, Megan snapped. I always pay. I'm showing no record of that transaction, the voice replied, unbothered. If you have proof of payment, please send it to the address listed. Megan hung up before the calm tone could make her feel small. When she checked her bank account, the truth was worse. She'd missed the autopay setup after her firm terminated her account privileges. One small oversight, one ripple of distraction, and the letter had found its way to her door. Across town, Ruth sat at her kitchen table, reading the same ledger. Hers, not Megan's. Lester had just emailed the quarterly report. Alton Equity Holdings was performing smoothly, the mortgage payments arriving right on schedule. She scanned the fine print where Megan's property line item sat in quiet, tidy balance. Pamela entered from the porch carrying 2 mugs of coffee. You're working again? Reading, Ruth said, closing her laptop. Sometimes those overlap. Pamela arched an eyebrow. You look pleased. I'm organized, Ruth replied, and that was all she said. 2 weeks later, Tyler packed up his apartment. His small contracting business had finally collapsed. Too many missed invoices. Too few clients willing to hire a man under a legal headline. He moved in with friends across town, his texts to Megan growing shorter, more strained. She answered them half-heartedly, her focus consumed by the letter on her counter and the growing fear behind it. The payments were falling behind. The fees were stacking. Every time she looked at the envelope from Alton Equity Holdings, her chest tightened. She tried calling again, but the same calm voice answered. The same patience. The same subtle tone that said, We don't need to threaten. You know the rules. By mid-May, the frost had lifted from Charlotte's lawns, replaced by the delicate green of spring. Ruth took her morning walk through Plaza Midwood, the air cool against her face, the streets alive with the scent of blooming magnolia. She turned a familiar corner, Megan's neighborhood. She hadn't meant to go that way, but her feet carried her without asking. The houses here were sleek and new, the kind her daughter sold to people who wanted status more than space. But Megan's home looked different now. The blinds half drawn, the grass patchy, the lights dim even in daylight. Up ahead, a man in a blue windbreaker hammered a wooden stake into the yard. The sign creaked as he straightened it upright. For sale. Bank owned. Ruth stopped across the street. The hammer strikes echoed down the quiet cul-de-sac, dull and rhythmic, like a clock winding down. The man wiped his brow and stepped back, admiring his work. He didn't notice the older woman watching from the sidewalk. Ruth took in the scene. The sign, the house, the faint shimmer of loss in the air, and for a long moment, she said nothing. Then she breathed in the cool wind, steady and slow, and whispered under her breath, Numbers never lie. A neighbor walking her dog passed and nodded politely. Ruth returned the nod, composed as ever. She lingered just long enough to see the for sale sign catch the sunlight, its edges glowing gold. Then she turned away, her steps measured, her shoulders square, as if she were walking out of a boardroom for the last time. Behind her, the hammer struck once more, sealing the post into the ground. Pamela would later ask her over lunch if she felt sorry for Megan. Ruth would only say, I warned them. What you plant will find you. And as she said it, her mind returned to the tulips in her garden. Vibrant, upright, alive. The cemetery sat just outside Charlotte's city limits, quiet and sun-dappled under a stretch of oaks. The breeze was warm, the kind that carried the hum of bees and the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the hill. Ruth stood in front of the modest marble headstone marked Edward Alton, 1907–1987, one hand resting on the cool stone. Pamela stood a few steps back, holding a small bouquet of tulips they'd cut from Ruth's garden that morning. White, yellow, and red. "He'd like the color," she said softly. Ruth smiled faintly. "He always said red was the color of keeping promises." From her bag, Ruth withdrew a framed photo. The one taken at the land trust signing. Her standing beside the conservation board, pen still in hand, smile quiet but certain. She placed it carefully against the base of the headstone, anchoring it with a small river rock. Beside it, she laid a folded envelope, handwritten in her elegant script. She didn't say what it contained, but Pamela already knew. Ruth had spent the night before writing it, steady and unhurried, as though she were balancing one final account. When Ruth finally spoke, her voice was calm but edged with memory. "It's done now, Grandpa. The land's protected, the scholarships are set, and the name—" She touched the engraving with her fingertips. "The name is clean again." Pamela placed the tulips down beside the letter. "You know," she said, smiling, "most people would have built fences to keep everyone out. You built something that lets them in." "That's what he would have done," Ruth said. "Legacy doesn't end in a ledger." They stood together for a long moment, the sunlight flickering through the trees, the sound of wind whispering across the grass. Then Ruth turned, exhaling deeply. Not grief, not relief, just release. Later that afternoon, back in Plaza Midwood, Ruth sorted through a small stack of envelopes on her kitchen table. They were handwritten, addressed in shaky cursive and smudged with fingerprints. The kind that came from genuine use, not formality. The first letter began, "Mrs. Alton, I'm the first recipient of your scholarship. I used to think women like me didn't get second chances. Now I'm studying accounting. I'm learning what balance means, not just in books, but in life. Thank you." Ruth smiled as she read it, her eyes softening. The second letter was shorter, written in blue ink on lined paper. "Dear Mrs. Alton, my mom says your fund paid for my daycare while she takes night classes. She said you gave her time. I'm 4. I like dinosaurs." A small drawing of a T-Rex was taped at the bottom. Pamela, who had dropped by with a fresh loaf of cornbread, peeked over her shoulder. "Dinosaurs, that's legacy right there." Ruth laughed quietly. "He's got better handwriting than half the attorneys I've dealt with." They carried the letters out to the porch. The air smelled of magnolia and cut grass. Across the yard, the tulips were in full bloom now, their colors blazing against the soft green of early summer. Ruth leaned back in her chair, the sunlight warm on her hands. "You know what's funny, Pam? For years I thought the fight was about money. It never was. It was about worth." Pamela nodded. "And you finally made them see it, even if they'll never admit it." Ruth gazed toward the street where children's bikes lay scattered and a neighbor's dog barked in the distance. "They'll understand one day. Maybe not soon. But one day." Pamela tilted her head. "You ever gonna tell them about the house?" Ruth smiled faintly. "No. Some lessons teach themselves." The phone on the side table buzzed, breaking the calm. Ruth reached for it, recognizing the number instantly. "Lester." "Everything's finished." His voice came through, firm and steady. "All holdings transferred. Final filings closed. They can't touch anything now. Not the land, not the fund, not your name." Ruth closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the certainty in his words. The fight that had once defined her days was finally over. Every number reconciled, every page sealed. "Thank you, Lester," she said, "for keeping me honest through all this." "Wasn't hard," he replied. "You do your own math." She chuckled. Always have. As the line clicked off, Ruth set the phone down and looked out over her garden once more. The breeze caught the tulips, setting them swaying like quiet applause. Pamela rose, gathering her things. I'll let you have your piece. You're part of it? Ruth said softly. Pamela smiled and slipped out through the gate, leaving Ruth alone with the hum of the evening cicadas and the fading light. Ruth picked up the letters again, running her thumb along their edges, then folded them neatly into her lap. The porch boards creaked as she leaned back, her eyes calm, her face illuminated by the gold wash of sunset. Somewhere, deep in her chest, the last vestige of tension eased. The war her children had started had ended not in noise, but in order. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had signed checks, raised children, and carried proof when love wasn't enough. Then, with a slow smile that was more victory than vengeance, she whispered, "They dragged my name through court, and I signed it in stone."